Hello, and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host, Rob. In today's video, we're going to be starting my series of campaign reviews, I guess we'll call them. And we're going to be starting with my Whitespire Campaign. I've had a few subscribers express some interest in this, and I think it'll be kind of fun. I don't expect these videos to be super popular, to be honest. They're going to be a little more niche, but that's okay. I think hopefully there'll be some information that maybe people could draw on for inspiration for their own campaigns or their own ideas. Or maybe people are just wondering, like, hey, where do you get some of your ideas from, right? And so I'm going to go through some of that kind of stuff, and I'm going to just go through like the stories of the campaigns. For Whitespire, it's probably going to be a 5-part series. I'm going to have, this one's going to be like I'm just going to call it part 0, essentially, and it's going to be the background, right? Then we'll do part 1, which will be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4, and we'll just cover the story. The second campaign that I'm going to cover, the Broken Lands campaign, is actually tied into the Whitespire campaign, but followed it. And they actually took place on different continents, but the players didn't really realize that at first. They thought that it was just a completely different game world because they weren't paying attention to the subtle clues I gave them, which were probably too subtle, to be honest. I was a little afraid of like giving that away, even though it wasn't really a big deal, but apparently I was far too subtle because they were like level 12 or 13 before anybody figured any of that out. But well, whatever, that's life. So for some quick background, I want to say up front, I steal things from other people constantly and very unashamedly as well. However, I do kind of like take things, blend them up, and come up with my own ideas. I often steal names. So for example, one of the dungeons that I ran was a thing called the Dark Reliquary, which came from Talus by Monty Cook, right? And Talus, I believe, was Monty Cook's own campaign setting for testing 3rd edition or 3.5. I don't remember. But anyways, he wanted to test the game rules, so he made his own setting, ran campaigns in there, and then decided eventually to just publish the setting because it was really cool. And that was actually one of the big places I drew a lot of inspiration from. But a lot of times I just drew like names from different places, or I'd print off the maps and then just run the dungeon. But I wouldn't necessarily use their encounters. I'd just use whatever was level appropriate. Like I think like characters did the Dark Reliquary like 17th or 18th level, which is probably higher than it was originally designed for. I think it was like 12 or 13 or something like that, or 10, somewhere around there. It wasn't low level, but it wasn't like, 18th level. So anyways, just some quick background on the city itself. My original concept was basically just that it had been built by a bunch of humans and dwarves working together, and my background story for that was essentially that the dwarves had been having a huge war with these orcs, and the orcs were being assisted by a bunch of dark elf like priestesses and wizards, right? And so over time the dwarves were just being pushed further and further and further back, but being quite proud and stubborn, they didn't want to ask the humans for help. Also, the human empire to the south had often had problems with the dwarves, and they'd had their own wars in the past. So when the dwarves finally realized hey, we could actually be facing extinction here, this is getting really bad, they decided to reach out for help. The dwarf king sends one of his own sons to personally bear the message, and the humans are just nah. However, some humans were moved, especially the high priest of the lawful good God of my Pantheon. Now, we'll get into the Pantheon in a moment. But he decides to send out a call throughout all the religion and manages to hurriedly assemble a tiny army of less than 1,000 soldiers. There's about 900 and change. But every one of them is a paladin or priest or cleric of the god. And they ride for a week straight, and of course arrive just in time, in true story fashion, to help turn the tide of the battle. And even though there's a small number of them, they manage to play a crucial role in the turning of the tides of this battle. And, legend has it, which of course is made by me, so we can assume this legend is correct, that the dwarf king and the high priest, side by side, managed to defeat and slay the orc general, the war chief, and kill one of his pet wizards as well, and drive the rest of them into flames. So the Dark Elves retreat back into the Deep, which is my version of the Underdark, but it's more or less the Underdark. They flee back into the Deep, and the Deep Roads, which is a name I stole from Dragon Age, and the orcs are driven back, and in their gratitude, the dwarves decide they will build a city for the humans and any of their own people who wish to stay as well to live in. And this is partly because the humans have all essentially just exiled themselves by going against the Emperor's commands, but also because the dwarves legitimately are very, very moved and very happy about this. So they built the city of Whitespire, and over time, Whitespire becomes this huge metropolis. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Part of it's the location. Part of it's because it's literally like on this major river, but also right on the ocean. And many of the other cities to the south have issues where the area is very mountainous. And so some of the other cities, there's like rocks and cliffs, and it's like hard for ships to come in and trade. But as luck would have it, Whitespire is essentially built on like a mountain that goes like under the ground, and it's just a sheer cliff, giving them this huge deep water port where ships, no matter how large they are, can just sail right up to the city and dock. Some of these other cities, they have to drop anchor, and they have to send crews on rowboats in order to trade, and it's a big hassle. So this made Whitespire very desirable. Plus, you had access to the dwarves, of course, as well, which was something that merchants often wanted. And over time, Whitespire became the largest city in my entire game world. And because Whitespire came from originally the followers of my lawful good god, it had this like very, very strong, like righteous and noble sense. However, I also liked the idea that over time, that had been kind of corrupted a bit. And they were still really big on the law, but a little less on the good. And I kind of like this idea of like this slow rot and decay. So that's the basic background on the city itself. As for some of the sources I used when I created my city, the best source for a lot of what I did was probably a product called The Blight by Frog God Games. And The Blight is huge. It's just a city called like Casterhague, I think it's called. The Blight itself is like 600 or 700 pages long, maybe 900. I can't even remember. It is massive, right? Frog God Games doesn't go halfway on anything. They're just all in on any project they make, right? And it was huge, and it was really, really awesome. Picture like London in like the Jack the Ripper era, but with magic, and everything is awful. Everything is terrible. It is just the most dark and depressing city you can imagine. And I loved a lot of that. But I also liked my idea of it being originally built by, this joining of the humans and the dwarves together and built on this like foundation of hope. The city itself, Whitespire, is a very like inspirational name, I think. And so I didn't while I really liked The Blight, it wasn't quite the atmosphere I was looking for. I wanted some of those elements, that Jack the Ripper era type stuff felt really cool to me, and I wanted that to be present, but I didn't want the whole city to be like that. And everything in The Blight was kind of like that. Like the queen in The Blight is like some crazy cannibal who's like secretly turning into a ghoul or something like that. I can't remember. Like everything is dark and depressing and dreary, right? And so I wanted a little more uplifting elements as well. I wanted some of those dark, dreary parts, but not everything like that, right? The next source I drew a lot from was Monty Cook's Tallest that I just mentioned. And Tallest had a lot of really interesting elements. I thought the history of his place was quite interesting. And so I kind of stole little bits and pieces of that as well and incorporated that into my own timeline. I also liked a lot of his names. So I took a lot of names like his Arcane Guild, which is basically the Mage Guild, the Bard Guild, the Sorcerer, like Wizard, Sorcerer, Bard, and Warlock all rolled into one. And it was called the Inverted Pyramid. I thought that was a cool name. I decided to use it. I also stole some of his NPCs. So in his case, the leader of the Inverted Pyramid was a girl called Jevica Noor. I decided to use her as well. But I leveled her down a bit because I liked the idea that the PCs would eventually become the highest level characters in my game world. And originally, I wasn't going to have any 20th level NPCs. There'd be like liches and other, and demigods and gods and demon lords and stuff. Other stuff that would be above like CR20 type creatures. But no actual like human, elf, dwarf, gnome, whatever NPCs who are going to be of 20th level. That did change. I ended up making one and one only, and that was the Iron Mage. But that was it, right? So even Jevica Nor, I scaled her back a little. I liked the idea that nobody in the Mage Guild could actually cast 9th level spells. I wanted it to be slightly more low magic. Not low magic in like the Conan sense, but not, you know, like Elminster, Mordenkainen type figures either, right? I wanted things to be just a little more low key. And like I said, I wanted the players to eventually be the most powerful people in the world. That was kind of the game plan from the start. In fact, like the one player, Troy, his character Magnus was a necromancer, and when he joined the Inverted Pyramid, the leader of the necromancer school inside the Inverted Pyramid was level 12, right? Like, you know, that's a pretty decent level. You can see like, oh, he's the most powerful necromancer in the city, but he's also level 12, right? I mean, he doesn't even have 7th level spells yet. So, you know, I kind of worked with a lot of those ideas. I did have one cleric, one high priest of one of the gods who was 17th level, but he was the only 9th level spellcaster in the entire city, and the game world itself only had like 2 others, right? So those were kind of some of the ideas I wanted there. I also took a lot of the names of different places, and then I'd either use their ideas, or sometimes I just change it and reskin it and make my own. But I liked a lot of the names, and it makes it easy for me to remember if I've like read it and I'm familiar with it, and I'm like, oh, I can just steal that name and use it somewhere else. As for the actual Pantheon of Gods, so in my case, I kind of had this idea originally, I was only going to have 9 gods, and I kind of liked that idea, and it was going to be 1 god of each alignment. I did get away from that. I started adding a lot more gods, and like even before the campaign started, I got away from that. So I kind of went with the idea that there were 9 greater gods who made up the 9, and then there were like lesser gods as well. And the 9 were kind of patterned on the idea of like this dysfunctional family where they'd all kind of like fight and feud amongst each other, but they were all united in one common cause, and that was destroying the heretics, which were basically any gods who were not of their particular pantheon. And I thought a good analogy would be like if you look at like ancient Greece and their city-states, like Sparta and Athens would fight all the time, right? But when the Persians invade, all of our differences are set aside because we have to fight the common foe, right? And that was kind of how I saw the 9. So even though you had lawful good and chaotic evil gods that would constantly be at each other's throats, when it came to fighting gods of other pantheons, they always managed to find common ground on that one. And so to represent that, I had a group called the Inquisition, which was essentially just clerics and paladins of all the 9 gods who'd formed their own group dedicated to hunting down and destroying the heretics. And by heretics, of course, we just mean anybody who doesn't worship the 9. Or the lesser gods that are, and demigods that are part of that pantheon. So, for the 9 gods themselves, some of them were original gods of my own. I actually wrote a book once. There it is right there, called the God Chronicles. I was a lot younger when I wrote it. I think that I'd write a better book these days if I ever feel to do so. But it does have some cool parts. I'm not saying it's bad or anything like that. But some of the gods I stole from that. Some of the gods I just took from other places. So anyways, I'll just go through the list. The lawful good god was Dawnblast the Justice Maker, who I actually took from the Michael Moorcock books. He's the god of law, justice, and the heavens. The neutral good god was Shara, the mother. She's the goddess of the sun, healing, fertility, and the harvest. The chaotic good goddess was Dresna, the guardian, and she was the goddess of beauty, love, battle, and those who protect the weak. And she was kind of like this champion of lost causes or hopeless causes usually. And I kind of pictured her as a combination of like Aphrodite and Athena all kind of like rolled into one, right? So she's this sensual goddess of love and beauty, but she's also the, protector goddess. And part of that is because one of the other goddesses is her twin sister, who is blind, and she is the guardian of her sister. So, so she's one that I invented, so is Shara. The lawful neutral god is Selene. She's the goddess of the moon and the night and the goddess of magic. She's kind of like Saloon, but not really, though. Different as well. She is also the daughter of Shara and Shara's husband, Anund, the Beast Lord, who is the next god on the list. Anund, the Beast Lord. He's the neutral god. He's the god of the hunt, god of animals, nature, and strength, and also the god of travel. Just because why not? He was one of my own creations as well, although he's not in my book. The chaotic neutral goddess is Mishnek. She is the goddess of fate, destiny, divination, and the unknown. She's the blind goddess and the twin of Dresna. I liked Mishnek as well because I like the idea of like divination and prophecy, and I thought that's why she'd make a good chaotic neutral goddess, because she is kind of like trying to like read possibilities and probabilities and threads of destiny and stuff, but it is kind of a chaotic jumble, right? So, you know, there you go. The lawful evil god is the K, who is the god of secrets, darkness, forbidden lore, assassins, and ambition. Because I only had 9 gods originally, they each had like a lot of different spheres of influence to explain what, you know, in order to kind of cover more ground, right? The K, however, wasn't originally one of the 9. He actually murdered a different god named Brad Dorag, who is the god of tyranny and such things, and he took his place. And I kind of felt the K was one of the least powerful of the 9, because he wasn't originally like a greater god. He kind of murdered his way and climbed the corporate ladder, so to speak, right? However, I really like the K, because his clerics are completely devoted to destroying information. He is the god of secrets, and they even try to hide information from each other. They will like burn libraries to the ground if they can sometimes. They will like find secret and forbidden lore and just destroy it. That is what they do. And I just like the idea of this like evil force going around and like just systematically trying to erase knowledge from history. And, you know, that makes some fun villains. The neutral evil god is Neril, god of war, death, the undead, and the underworld, taken from the Greyhawk realms. I pictured Neril as being one of the stronger gods because war and death are 2 of the big domains. Forget the fact that in Greyhawk he ends up being supplanted by the Raven Queen, though. I think it was Greyhawk. Anyways, the chaotic evil goddess was Tiamat, and she is the goddess of the sea, dragons, chaos, monsters, destruction, and greed. And basically, I kind of elevated Tiamat to like god level, kind of like Takhisis from the Kryn books, if anybody's ever read the Dragonlance books. Now, I also had a secret 10th god, which was, of course, if you're going to have Tiamat, Bahamut. But the idea was that Bahamut had once been like the lawful good god, but he'd been, originally Tiamat hadn't been evil either, and they'd actually been allies. But eventually Tiamat turns evil, she betrays him, and she seals him away. And so I kind of had this idea that I had these primordials who were kind of like the Greek Titans, and they were the creators of the universe. And Tiamat and Bahamut were actually 2 of the primordials, not the actual gods themselves. However, when the gods defeat the primordials, the gods realize, after killing a bunch of the primordials, that since the primordials created the universe, that the gods actually can't kill all the primordials or the universe will be destroyed. So since Tiamat ends up kind of like helping them, she gets to live, and Bahamut end up getting sealed away, kind of as insurance in case they ever had to worry about Tiamat turning on them. They could like destroy her, and Bahamut would still be around. They could just, you know, release him again back into the universe, kind of thing. So I kind of liked that idea that I would have this, you know, Bahamut, who used to be the lawful good god, but now he's gone. And to be fair to Dawnblast, Dawnblast was kind of like one of his generals or like most powerful servants. And Dawnblast doesn't know what happened. He just knows that one day Bahamut disappeared. So he just kind of had to step up, you know, and become the man now, so to speak. But it is his followers who created Whitespire. So Dawnblast, despite being one of the weaker gods of the 9, because again, he kind of stepped up into the role, wasn't actually there originally. He is one of the main gods of Whitespire. Like, Whitespire is kind of his city because it was the priests and, you know, clerics and paladins of him that built the city along with the dwarves. So he's kind of elevated in the city to a higher importance than what he'd normally have. And there's a bunch of minor gods too. One of them was the Iron God, who I thought was kind of interesting because I had like my country was kind of like a combination of ancient China and then elements of like Vietnam and Cambodia because my wife is Vietnamese and I have friends from Cambodia, so I decided to steal parts of their culture as well, right? So I kind of stole that and made my country, and that's where all my Asian type people are from my world, right? But they worship a god called the Iron God, and the dwarves also worship the Iron God, who may or may not be the same god. It just turns out that, at one point they're talking and they're like, oh, we worship this god who taught us how to use the forge and brought us fire. And they're like, oh, that's the Iron God. And they're like, well, he's not made of iron, but he does wear plate mail from head to foot. Maybe it's the same guy, Who knows? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Even I haven't decided. Either way, I kind of like that idea. And then there's a bunch of other gods as well. Of note, some more gods that I stole from Michael Moorcock would be the Sword Rulers, which are Ariok, the Knight of Swords, Zionberg, the Queen of Swords, her brother, the brother of Ariok, sorry, or sister, there we go, whatever. Doesn't matter, they're all chaos creatures, they can just, do whatever they want. And then the King of Swords, Malraux the Faceless. And those were more worshipped by a lot of the evil races in my world. Oh, there's also Set as well, who's worshipped by like the Yuan-Ti and the Serpent Folk of Yig and some of these other type of groups, right? But they're worshipped more by like the Dark Elves and stuff. I don't really have Lolth in my world. Zionberg kind of fills that role. And then Ariok is more worshipped by like the warrior caste of like the Dark Elves and other type groups. Zionberg's like the priestess class, and then Malraux's like the wizard class, right? So that kind of represented the factions of the Dark Elf Society. And then I just kind of expanded into some of the other dark evil races as well, because I was like, this is a lot of work for just the Dark Elves. We'll expand this. So anyways, that was the basic ideas on the religions. There's a bunch of other gods as well, but nobody really cares that much. Anyway, so that's the Inquisition. The last thing I wanted to really talk about a bit were the player characters themselves. So we had 5 players in the campaign. One player did switch characters partway through and then went back to the original character right at the very end. So we'll talk about that when we get to like those relevant sections of the campaign diary. The characters themselves, though, were Crag, who is a barbarian, and even though you shouldn't have favorites as like a parent, you don't want to have favorite children, Crag was my favorite. All the players know that too. It's not because the player is my favorite, though. Looking at you, Jaden. It's because Crag was freaking awesome. Crag was everything you want a barbarian to be. He was amazing in combat. He was terrible at everything that wasn't combat. And because Jaden just like loved the character so much and just really role-played him to the max, it just made Crag delightful. Because like I said, he was amazing in combat, but he was, as great as he was at combat, he was equally terrible at every other aspect of the game. And this really made him just glorious. Because he wasn't useless. He had a definite function in that party. He was great in that little sphere. But, like as a quick example, in one game, Crag was on this like vision quest thing, and the rest of the party had to protect his body and fight all these like waves of things that came for him. But meanwhile, Crag was going through all these like, basically he was living through the lives of his different ancestors and seeing the history of his tribe and stuff, right? And he had to make a series of wisdom saving throws to prevent the mounting psychic damage as he went through. He failed all 7 wisdom saving throws, over 7. Technically over 8, because he had inspiration, re-rolled one of those failed saves, and failed that as well. And the saving throws did become more difficult as they went, but they started at like a DC 12 or something, right? So we went like 12, 13, 14, so this went up by 1. 0 for 8. So like, I don't even know how that's possible. Even though you're not proficient, just random dumb luck. On 8 attempts, you should at least succeed on 1 of them. But no, 0 for 8. Absolutely a legend. I loved Crag. Anyway, so that was Crag, the Dragonborn barbarian. Next we have Cole. Cole was a bard, and he was like a traveling merchant type who wanted to build his own financial empire. And he wasn't really like the singing, dancing, performing flute type instrument bard. He was more like a teller of tales, and he liked to go around to all these different places and collect like lore and history and stuff, and then he'd tell these like big dramatic tales of like the different events from history and whatnot. And I just kind of like that idea of like the storyteller aspect rather than like the performer. He's still a performer, but you know, and an entertainer, but not really like the musical type, right? And so that was Cole. He was human. Next we had another Dragonborn, who was Shadaza. All my Dragonborn were actually created by this one evil lich guy, who I also stole from Talos, named Gull the Half God. I don't know if Gull the Half God was the actual lich in Talos, but he was like an arc lich in my game. And he actually created all the Dragonborn as to be like his army, essentially. But eventually when he disappeared and, you know, things went bad, you know, they all got their independence. Shadaza was a Oath of the Ancients paladin. She originally, so in my game world, one of the things I wanted to do was that the characters, when they got their subclass, they would actually choose like different schools or temples or whatever to be affiliated with, right? So for example, she was originally going to be associated with Dawnblast and that temple, but she started realizing there were a few elements there that just weren't quite what she was looking for, because she did some investigation, found some of the hints at the secrets behind the scenes. So when she took the Oath of the Ancients, she swore her way with Anun, the Beast Lord, the, you know, god of nature, essentially, right? And took the Oath of the Ancients instead. So, you know, that was that. Magnus, by the way, did the same thing when he swore. Once he reached level 2, he was able to pick a school of wizards, so he applied to the Necromancer branch of the Inverted Pyramid, who accepted him into their ranks, right? So yeah, that was Shadaza, the Dragonborn Paladin. And next we had Alatar, who was a half-elf. He was a sorcerer, Stormborn sorcerer. And he was kind of an orphan who didn't know who his parents were, but he was raised by a bunch of gnomes, and so he just loved gnomes, even though he was a half-elf. He was from outside the city. Cole was also from outside the city, but he'd been to Whitespire a bunch of times because it's a major trade hub, right? That'll be relevant in a moment when I talk about some of the stuff I did with the player characters. Later on, Mike switched out his character, like I said, and played Rin, who was a wood elf fighter. He was a arcane archer. Oh man, the damage that guy did, it was just sickening. He could do like 200 or 300 damage in a round sometimes at high level when he was using sharpshooter and used action surge. Like it was insane. Anyways, finally we have Magnus. Oh, Alatar was also a very innocent type. Like I said, he was raised by a bunch of gnomes out in like a forest somewhere, and really knew nothing about the city. At one point, he ended up like somebody. He asked some person what would be a good place for him to go. The guy recommended a brothel. He thought that it was an inn, and so he just got a room there. And then eventually, he ended up buying the brothel, but he never actually had relations with any of the girls that worked there, even though they all really liked him. And of course, he's got super high charisma, so they all liked him a lot. But they just assumed that he was probably gay at some point, because he just clearly didn't seem to be interested in them. For his part, he just thought that they were a bunch of really nice girls, but some of them just had too many boyfriends. He couldn't believe how many boyfriends some of them had. And Alatar was quite funny as well. Mike did a great job of just playing the character for laughs, and like ridiculous levels of innocence and naivete were just kind of delightful in a lot of ways. As opposed to Rin, who had no discernible personality at all, Mike. But that's okay, you made up for it with Alatar. Magnus, finally. So my friend Troy played Magnus Kane, who was a wizard. He became a necromancer. Magnus was lawful evil, and right from the get-go told the party that if he ever had a chance to betray them for ultimate power, he would do so. So I like the fact that he was honest about it, because he is lawful. And he eventually did do this, fulfilling that promise ever since level 1 that he had originally committed to at level 20 when he betrayed the party. which led kind of indirectly into the second campaign that we'll cover in later videos. So finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about was, for more background work, Magnus was born and raised in Whitespire. He was actually an orphan whose parents had died at an early age, possibly why he wanted to become a necromancer, because he wanted to understand death and stuff, right? So that was Magnus. So one of the things I wanted to do for each character, because a lot of them had lived in Whitespire all their lives or had been there many times, I liked the idea that they weren't just coming in fresh, not knowing anything. So I made up a list. I've shown this in one other video, I think, but that video got like 30 views, so none of you guys ever saw it. But I basically, for every player character, I made a list of like 2 people you know and trust, 2 people you've met, 2 secrets you've learned, and 2 things you've seen or heard. And basically these were just like plot hooks to draw them in. And like, the 2 people you know and trust were NPCs that they could actually rely on and could go to for information and stuff, who were usually tied into their background. 2 people you've met were often just like ways to get like missions or quests or whatever, contacts that they could reach out to, interesting people, but not necessarily ones they could know or trust, right? These people might betray them, might whatever, right? Mostly it was just a way of getting them more plot hooks, though. And then the 2 secrets these were like, things they knew that were true, but usually they didn't know the whole truth, right? It would be like a strong clue or hint into something going on in the city that then hopefully they would want to investigate. And 2 things you've seen or heard were just plot hook type, little rumor type things, right? That some of them were, all of them were at least partly true. I didn't want to just like mislead them on complete red herrings, right? But, it wasn't like the 2 secrets 2 secrets was kind of like the 2 people you know and trust, right? That was like the higher level of stuff. And then the, 2 people you've met and the 2 things you've seen or heard, that was like the lower level, right? And I did that for each character, and that way they'd have people in the city that they could go to. Because I wanted the idea that, if you've lived in this city all your life, you're going to know some people. You're going to have some contacts. There are going to be people that you can reach out to, right? And so that was basically what I did for the campaign. When I get into like the different segments, like, I'm basically just going to break it into tiers of play, like I said. So, part 1 will be like the first tier of play, 2, 3, and 4, all the way to 20, right? And I should also probably mention, I tend to use, I always use milestone experience in my games, and I tend to level up characters at a fairly quick pace. So a lot of people think like, how do you have so many campaigns that have gone to like 18, 19, 20th level? It usually is because every 4 or 5 game sessions, the players will accomplish whatever their task or mission was, and I'll give them all a level, right? I know that a lot of people like a slower level pace. I think that's perfectly fine too. It all depends what kind of game you're looking to run. But I knew this game was going to be like big and epic, and I wanted the players to reach 20th level, So I knew that if I had enough content to keep the game running every week for 2.5, maybe 3 years, that's a lot of game sessions, but I want them to get the 20th level, so, they're going to have to be able to do that. So that's usually the method I use. I use milestone experience, and when they've completed a big story element, they level. Now, if they just leveled last week, I might not level them again, but I always, if they're going from level 1 to 2, by the end of the game, first game session, they're always level 2, if not level 3, depending on how long we played, right? But I don't think that's unreasonable. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with leveling your players slower. I think that slower experienced games are perfectly fine too. I've used a lot of those in the past. Just for this particular campaign, both of these campaigns really, I just like the idea of the players getting to high level, because I like a lot of high level play. I like a lot of big epic stuff, And it's not that you can't be big and epic at low levels too. You can. But, I liked the idea. I knew that at some point the players were going to be traveling to other planes of existence. They were going to be fighting different gods and stuff, right? Or not gods necessarily, but like, demigods, whatever, right? And, big CR challenges, right? I've mentioned this before, but one of the villains that I'm going to talk about as we go through this campaign was Bellatrix, the Widow of Lust, who was like a demon queen. And one of the player characters, Shadowzad, the paladin, met her at level 1. And I mean, they weren't enemies at level 1, because obviously she would have gotten destroyed by like a CR28 demon lord, right? But she met her when she was level 1. And, you know, at that point, the player character was some lowly acolyte in the temple. Bellatrix doesn't have any interest in her. She's like in disguise. Bellatrix liked to seduce people and then corrupt things from the inside, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why there's so much rot at the heart of the city. Oh, I should also mention one last thing before we wrap this video. I wanted there to be a lot of like political dysfunction in the city, because I wanted the player character's choices to matter. And so one of the things I decided on early on was that the king was going to be basically incapable of ruling because he has dementia. So the king's like 78. He's been married 3 different times, and he's named the daughter from his 3rd marriage the heir. And of course he did that like 19 years ago when she was born, right? So the the heir is like 19, but she's also from the 3rd marriage, and she has older like half brothers and sisters who are in their 40s and 50s and are actually much more capable than her. However, she's a very good person, if a little naive as well, and not particularly bright, but she is charismatic. She's not an idiot either, right? She's just, you know, she's not exactly super intelligent. She has like an 8 intelligence, you know, that was her dump stat. But she has a lot of good qualities as well. So she's been named the heir, but she's got like a bunch of half brothers and sisters that are all older than her, that all probably think they could do the job better than her. Some are much more ruthless than her, and yet the king's still alive, so nobody's inherited yet. And because the king can't really rule, this has kind of set up a political system where things are quite dysfunctional. I also had a series of judges, one of whom, by tradition, of course, is always the high priest of Dawnblast, because his priest made the city. So they kind of might have, you know, and of course they're lawful good. I mean, he's the god of justice after all. Obviously his representative is going to be the bastion of truth and justice in the city. That could never, ever, ever go wrong. Ever, of course. So he's one of the 3 chief justices, and then there were like 7 lesser justices, right? So a lot of the decision making is kind of fallen on them, but really like they're under the oversight of the king, who can veto or overrule their rules, except that right now he's not. But they kind of want to take more power for themselves. But on the other hand, the king's heirs and some of the nobility do not like that much. And, you know, so there's kind of like all the weird power struggles. And I like those kind of elements because it gives you a lot more room for like interesting play, but also room for the character decisions to really start to matter. Because they don't really have, you know, like now you have nobles that are like, hey, we want you to do this for us because nobody else is going to get this done, right? Like nobody's calling shots anymore. Nobody's taking charge. Everybody's too busy infighting, but we need this to get done, you know? So please go do this for me, right? And I kind of liked that sort of element. Not that cannibal queens who are turning into ghouls isn't also cool. I like that idea. It just wasn't, you know, what I was looking for here. But I like the idea of an incapable king, blurred lines of succession, noble houses that are at each other's throat, all that kind of stuff. That makes for a lot of interesting political intrigue. Or at least it would be interesting to me. My players ignored almost all of it entirely, so, you know, not interesting to them. But that's all right too. That's one of the reasons I like to have notes on stuff, but not do detailed notes unless I need the information. So I might have a noble house. I'll write down some names. Oh, this is the house, like the leader. This is so and so. This is, you know, the wife. This is their children. Her husband died of mysterious circumstances because she actually poisoned him, you know, or whatever, right? And I have a few brief notes like that. That'll give me some ideas. If I need to flush it out, now I've got something to work with. But I didn't spend, like, you know, writing out detailed genealogy of each noble house because the players just may not ever care, right? So anyways, that's the background. That was some of the preparation work that I did, kind of like taking a bunch of different sources of inspiration and then just mixing in all my own ideas with it, throwing in a bunch of my own NPCs, but also stealing NPCs from other stuff because they made some great NPCs, so why not take advantage of that, right? There's more work I can save for myself, the better, honestly. and then wanting the players to feel integrated into the city even though they hadn't played in it yet. So just talking to them all before the game started, getting their background ideas, finding out whether or not they were native to the city or not, and then tailoring different like plot hooks to each player character based on their history, where they're from. You know, so for example, Cole the Traveling Merchant, his plot hooks were mostly stuff outside the city, but he had contacts inside the city, mostly at different like merchant houses and trading guilds, right? Because those are the people he meets, right? And that's who he works with. Also, he knew a constable who he did not care for because the guy was kind of a jerk, who was, always investigating this kind of stuff and was like an absolute stickler for the law. It wasn't that he was evil, it's just that he was not too big on mercy and kindness and all about the law, as many people in Whitespire were. So anyways, I think I'm going to end that video right there. That gives you the basic background and preparation. And in the next video I do in this series, we'll get into the Tier 1 play and kind of the adventures, and I'll just kind of talk about what happened and some of the fun and ridiculous things that happen along the way, many of which will involve Crag. So, yeah, that's everything. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and of course, most importantly, leave me your comments in the comment section. Hopefully, if anybody actually watched all this video, they enjoyed it. I kind of enjoyed making it, so whatever. I'll continue the series, and like I said, I'll still be making my regular videos on top of that. This is just kind of a side project, all these like campaign review things. But I just want to get more content out there, so, why not? Anyways, that's everything. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.